Hello, everyone. Hi. It's good to see everyone. Welcome. For those who are not members of SAJ, we welcome you and so glad you're with us today. Hello to everyone on the Zoom. It's lovely to see SAJ members, longtime SAJ members, as well as HaBonim and colleagues and Reconstructionist friends over other parts of the country. So I am so happy to be able to just briefly introduce this program so we could get started. We just wanted to let everyone know in the room that the program is being recorded and is not currently going to YouTube, but likely we will upload it after to YouTube. So if you ask a question or participate in some way, just know that. Right now, all people can see are your backs of your heads, so don't worry about that part. So we're very, very excited to welcome you. Thank you for coming down. We're happy to have Rabbi Eddie Feld, who served SAJ as rabbi and spiritual leader from 1991 to 1994, was the senior editor of Machzor Lev Shalem, which is an amazing holiday program. Came out very recently. Siddur Lev Shalem for Shabbat and festivals, the author of Joy, Despair, and Hope, Reading Psalms and the Spirit of Renewal, Finding Faith After the Holocaust. He has served as rabbi in residence at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Hillel director. He served as a Hillel director and college chaplain at Princeton University, University of Illinois, and Smith and Amherst colleges. So also, even though we're technically after 2022 and our 100th anniversary, we are considering this an extension of our 100th anniversary programs because we wanted to make sure we brought and included all of our former rabbis into our programming and clergy as cantors as well. And the seat that will soon be taken up by Abe, who will facilitate the conversation. Abe Clott is an active member of the SAJ. That's kind of an understatement of the century. A former chair of the SAJ board, 2 times over. I got to benefit from that the second time around. Sits as an acting justice of the criminal term of the Supreme Court in New York County, presiding over felony matters. So they're going to have a conversation and talk about your book and talk about your scholarship and what you've learned. And I know that this is really exceptional and new scholarship that most of us have not had a chance to sink our teeth into. So I know I'm really looking forward to that. And afterwards, Rabbi Lisa Gelber, wherever you are, Rabbi Lisa, will offer some response. Okay, without further ado.
All right, welcome, shalom. Is a great pleasure and somewhat intimidating to be sitting next to Rabbi Feld, facing an audience of people, probably all of whom are more qualified than I am to have this conversation, but I'll do my best. I'll just begin by setting the context. Some people have heard my coming to the SAJ story, which was I happened to come visit one week. After hearing Rabbi Feld speak, I spent the rest of the week thinking about what he had said. Had to come back the next week. Same thing happened again, and by the third week, I was in. Rabbi Feld really had a very great influence on my Jewish life, really changed the way I thought about my Judaism and related to my Judaism. We've been blessed with an extraordinary succession of great rabbis here at the SAJ, each with their own qualities. So it's no disrespect to any of Rabbi Feld's predecessors or successors to say there never again arose at the SAJ a teacher such Rabbi Feld. Rabbi Feld's teaching is absolutely extraordinary. And that extends very much to this book. After finishing it the first time, I thought I could say what it was about. After finishing it the second time, I had a completely different idea of what it was about. It purports to be about biblical history and law, but as you'll see over the course of the conversation, is really about every subject of concern and inquiry to any thinking contemporary Jew. The book touches on really every major religious and philosophical question we raise. So I'll begin by asking, the book is presented as about law and biblical history. On the very first page, I think you say it originated from your encounters with JTS students about biblical criticism and arose from your attempts to address with rabbinical students the difficulty of encountering biblical criticism. So why don't we start there?
First of all, I want to say what a pleasure it is for me to be here at the SAJ, and how important for my own development, my tenure at the SAJ was, and how significant the people who were here remained for me, and many of whom have passed by now, but were certainly, I have wonderful memories. I know Sylvia Rips was on the Zoom. Your husband had this amazing conversation with me, which I remember to this day. So it's true of many of the people who were here, and I want to just remark about how it was very important for me to come back here to talk about the book, and this is a special moment for me. Solomon Schechter famously called biblical criticism, which was then known as higher criticism, as higher anti-Semitism. There was a kind of people who, in its origin, the people who engaged in biblical criticism were trying to destroy something. They were trying to, one of the first biblical critics is Spinoza, and Spinoza was trying to say, hey, the Jewish community has it all wrong, I have it right, and here's why you can't trust the Bible, because it's just a product of history. The students at the seminary had a similar reaction. Not quite that it was anti-Semitism, but knowing that there are multiple layers in the Bible and multiple authors destroyed their belief with which they had come into the seminary. That is to say, they had come with a certain kind of faith, naive faith, perhaps, and then taking a Bible course, it fell apart. I wanted to show that you could do biblical criticism, that you could show the layers and which had come into the biblical canon, the layers which had made up Torah, that they all represented a kind of spiritual outpouring that had something to teach us. That is to say, that biblical criticism was not a way to destroy Torah, but that biblical criticism could be a way of rediscovering Torah. That is, by understanding the historical circumstance out of which things came and why people said what they did, one could recover the sensibility which had originally impelled these incredible insights into religious life. So that was the project.
Let's press on that a bit more, because back in the day when you were the rabbi, we were still using the Hertz Chumash, which was a continuous screed against higher criticism. I think looking around at the age of everyone in this room, I think we all grew up probably on the Hertz Chumash and being taught really the anti-Semitism of biblical criticism. And one feature of the book I find so striking is you don't defend the tradition against criticism. You don't kind of explain away or explain around it or say, okay, given what we know from history, here's what's left. I've never encountered before any attempt such as yours to use the insights of the critical research and the historical research to deepen spirituality and deepen faith. So if you want to say a bit more about your approach there, because to me it seemed really unique.
So what you just reminded me of is that the book just got reviewed in both the Civitas Civilica, which is the newspaper of the Vatican See, and the book was called A Gem, and just got reviewed in Commonweal magazine, and which is a Catholic publication, and Commonweal says it's a must read. So people of faith, not only of Jewish faith, but people of faith are finding in it a way of talking about history which doesn't undercut faith, but in fact shows us insight into the religious life and into the spiritual life.
So you explain how the earliest, Rabbi Feld discusses 3 codes, 3 different parts of the 5 books. You explain how the earliest, the Covenant Code, arises from a military political situation, a coup. You explain how the second, the Law Code, Deuteronomy, arises from the aftermath of an assassination. You explain how all these events could have played out differently. What does it mean for our religious identity to be rooted in texts that reflect wars, battles, assassinations, the March of Empires, events that could have come out differently? Does this bring us closer, or does it make it seem less relevant?
So let's step back a little bit. There are several thousand little female figurines that have been found associated with Jewish settlements in the land of Israel. They are figurines with a woman holding her breasts. And the likeliest interpretation is that these are fertility images, which perhaps a farmer would plant in his soil or have in his house, and I say his because the Book of Kings also mentions that there were women weaving in the temple tapestries for the Asherah. The Asherah, the goddess, the consort of God, of Yud-He, Vav-He, Astarte. There was in the temple, we're told, a chariot to the sun, right? A depiction of the sun chariot. There were something called male prostitutes. We don't know what their function was, whether they in fact were sexual or not, or whatever but that was part of the temple courtyard. It's not entirely clear that belief in one God, or belief in Yud-He, Vav-He, would have triumphed, or was more traditional than any of these other beliefs. Certainly these other beliefs were widespread. I said there are thousands of figurines, that it's not a question of one person worshiping, it's of what was popular religion. So to fight for the idea that there was only one God was a battle. And the subtitle of the book is The Battles of Priests, Prophets, and Kings. They were actual battles. They were battles over two very important issues: belief in one God, and that the essence of God was ethical. That the essence of God was a concern for the most vulnerable, for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan. And that you had gone out of Egypt not to oppress anyone else. Now, those ideas were not necessarily natural ideas. People, there was an elite that had slaves. There were plenty of people who did not feel that you were rewarded if you were ethical. On the contrary, my teacher Yochanan Mufs taught us, and I'm happy to be able to remember him and mention his name. He was a lovely human being, and Yochanan Mufs taught us that when you have multiple divinities, you don't have ethics. Because what you have with multiple divinities are God's divine forces battling with each other, and you're siding with one against the other. And so in this, if you think of Greek mythology, in Greek mythology, the essence of the divinity is not ethics. On the contrary, gods are competitive with one another. They're fighting with one another. They're using human beings to war against other divine forces. That's the story of Greek mythology. And that would have been our story if the prophetic vision had not triumphed. And that it wasn't clear that they would triumph. In fact, up to the moment of exile, Jeremiah reports that in the valley of Hinnom, just down from the temple, people were sacrificing their sons, child sacrifice. We don't know, the language of the Bible is ma'avir beno ba'esh. They passed their children through the fire. It may have been a symbolic offering, it may have been a real offering. We don't know. But clearly they were doing something which is absolutely abhorrent to the biblical mind. Moments before the exile. So the triumph of these ideas ultimately was due to the fact that in exile, people rethought, if we go back, what is it we want and how do we want to live? And they created out of that a whole compendium of the tradition, which we call Torah. And it's a very specific kind of tradition, a tradition of belief in one God, a tradition of belief in ethics, and that Torah becomes our heritage.
So that the audience has a framework, why don't we back up? And it would be helpful if you sketched out briefly the chronology of the covenant code, the law code, the holiness code, what the key themes are of each, and then the successive roles of the prophets in each. Because as you just alluded to, that's central to the continuity of what became the Jewish tradition.
I'll try to do that in a much shorter version than the book.
Sum up the whole book.
One of the reasons why I chose to do law rather than narrative, usually biblical criticism is shown through narrative, is that in narrative, it's very hard to distinguish which layer things are. I'm in this last week's parasha, the story of the golden calf. I was looking at biblical critics and what they were saying about how this was put together. So some say it's J, some say it's J-E, some say it's J-E, but a little of D. And that kind of, one can't quite determine the distinct authorship of many of the passages. Robert Alter had a wonderful phrase about it. He said, the Torah is like an omelet. It's made up of several different elements, several different eggs and other ingredients, but once cooked, you can't separate them out. But the law code is quite different. The law codes are in three very distinct places in the Bible, in the Torah, and they are, you can compare one to the other and see very significant differences. If you read Exodus, the Parshat Mishpatim, if you read Exodus, you read that a slave works for 7 years. A Hebrew slave works for 7 years. If you read Deuteronomy, you have almost the same language, and Deuteronomy says, but when you free the slave, you have to give the slave a gift, which is a wonderful new addition. It's that you can't just free a person, because they're just they'll be impoverished and go back into slavery. What you have to do is give them something so that they can start on their own. If you read the holiness code in Leviticus, if you read the second half of Leviticus, you will discover that there should be no Hebrew slaves. Because you were slaves in Egypt, you should enslave none of your fellow Israelites. So you have three codes talking about the same thing, and you can see the differences, and you can tell we're in 3 different moments. If you read Exodus, there is the most wonderful ethical teaching. If you see the donkey of your neighbor, and the donkey has overthrown their load, that is to say, their load has fallen from them. If you see the donkey of your enemy, you must help reload the donkey. Right? You don't just go by. Even though this person is your enemy, even though the loss of goods will be that for your enemy, there's a human factor here. Their cart has been overturned. You have to help them. That's in Exodus. In Deuteronomy, you find the exact same wording with just one word changed. If you find the donkey of your neighbor and the goods have been overturned, you should help them. The difference between helping the enemy and helping the neighbor. So you see, what you see is how one place in the Torah takes material from another place and reworks it. The fact of these contradictions and changes means that we have clear evidence that we're working with different times and places. And then we have to ask the question, why? What's going on? What is motivating these different changes? On the one hand, Deuteronomy is more ethical than Exodus. On the other hand, it appears to be less. So I looked at Exodus, and my teacher, Professor Ginsburg, showed that the Exodus piece is a product of northern Israel. And I then talked the history of northern Israel and where that came from. Northern Israel was wiped out by Assyria in approximately 720 BCE. So I have a date. If it's northern Israel, it couldn't be later than that. Deuteronomy, there is consensus among biblical scholars that Deuteronomy is the product of the reign of Josiah. And so we're talking approximately 640 BCE. You know, he dies in 620 something. So we have dates. And Leviticus has a set of laws. They're called the Holiness Code because it begins in the middle of Leviticus. Leviticus just first half. It's all about priests and sacrifices and impurity and purity and you know it's the parshiot where at least rabbis try to discover other material to talk about and when we get to the middle of Leviticus, which is the middle of the Torah. And in the ancient world, the middle was the height, the climax of a book was the middle. The climax of Lamentation is the 3rd chapter. It has 5 chapters. The climax is in the middle. And in the middle you have, you shall be holy because the Lord your God is holy. But then, sort of a few chapters later, we have another law which says in the Jubilee, every 50 years, you go back to the land which was given to you in the time of, which your family has from the time of Joshua. Now, we know from archaeological evidence that there was no conquest in 7 years in which the whole Canaanites were tossed out and suddenly everything was settled. The imagination that there was a time when your family had a plot of land, every family had an equal plot of land, is a result of exile. When we go back, we want to go back and everybody will have an equal share, and we'll go back to the way it was at the beginning when we all started out being equal. And if it doesn't work out, every 50 years we'll do this, we'll go back to that. Now, there is no record of anywhere in the entire Bible of ever having celebrated a jubilee. No kings are in the third year of the reign of this king, and this happened in the seventh year. And Amos has a year after the earthquake. You have ways of dating. Nobody dates by the Jubilee because nobody celebrated the Jubilee in biblical times. It's entirely an invention of the exile. It's entirely it's a beautiful invention. It's a dream. When we go back, we will all be equal. When we go back, we'll all have a share in the land. That dream is only possible not being on the land. When you have people actually living there and having farms, you don't dream like that, right? So we can date the different materials. We can date Exodus, we can date Deuteronomy, we can date the Holiness Code in Leviticus. And that drew me to this effort of being able to tell the story of those moments and why they wrote what they did.
So then we'll leap ahead to what do we do with these differences? Because another, I think, unique, striking feature of the book is you don't try to reconcile. You don't lay out the story I was taught, in Reconstructionist Hebrew school. Well, there was the progress of civilization, and this piece was from our childhood, and that piece was from our adolescence, and there's an orderly progression. You say we have these three codes, and this is the basis for the inevitable, never-ending diversity and variety of Jewish approach.
It is really amazing that the final compilation of the Torah didn't try to unify all these differences, but preserved their distinctness. There was almost a sensibility, it might have been done for political reasons. That may be the reason why. I can't tell you why they did it. I can only tell you their effect, which is the sensibility that a human being is complex, and there isn't one single way of behaving. First of all, in any group, there isn't one single way of behaving, and within ourselves, there isn't one single way of behaving. And so by preserving the different theologies, what one did was preserve a kind of rounded Judaism rather than a single-minded Judaism. Exodus talks about covenant. It says, Zeh Sefer HaBrit, this is a covenant. Covenants are made between I, as a free individual, enter into a relationship with you who are a free individual. God enters into a relationship with Israel. We both stand together, and we stand in relationship to one another. And we agree, we work out an agreement between us. Deuteronomy says you are commanded to do this. The word mitzvah appears more often in the book of Deuteronomy and variations of the phrase that uses mitzvah than any other book of the Bible. Deuteronomy says you are commanded by God to do this. The Holiness Code has a different theology. The Holiness Code says you should be holy because God is holy. You should try as much as you can to reach for the divine within you. And life is a progress. And you don't get there, you're never going to be God, but you can transform your life so that you are closer and closer to the divine. So those are three different paths. And what I write in the last chapter at the end of the book, what I have to say about myself is that there are different times in my life, even different times in the week, different times in the day, when these different theologies speak to me. There are moments when I am really affirming my own individuality and say about Torah, this I'm willing to accept, this I'm not willing to accept. This I'll do it this way, but I want to do it my own way. I realize that there is a tradition, but I also realize that I'm a full human being and want to transform it in a way that reflects my inner life. There are moments when I feel I don't have a choice. I have to do it. When I first began observing Shabbat as an adult, I said to myself, I'm going to observe it for 2 weeks, but then the third week I'm not going to observe it because I don't want anything to take over my life. I want to be in control. The third week came and I couldn't give up Shabbat. So there are times when I just feel I don't have a choice. I have to do this. And there are times when I feel, how do I access the soul within me? The most important thing that I want to do now is to turn inward and to transform my life so that I'm living in relationship to holiness. All of that, all of these different moments are moments which are true to me. And what the Torah provides is a language by which I can access all these different aspects of my own religious life.
When you announce the subject as law, that gives rise to a set of preconceptions about law. But as you just outlined, the three different bases in the codes, this is law in very different senses. Is law a useful term? One of the most surprising statements in the book for me, since I hadn't seen it before, is when you demolish the myth of the 613, because we all know there are 613 commandments and blah, 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 blah. And you have this beautiful passage about why it's a metaphor and why thinking in terms of 613, that's really not what Jewish law is about, as I understand you saying.
So The way they got to 613 was that there were 365 days of the year, and there were 200, somebody do the math for me, 256 or something like that, 200, thank you, 248 parts, organs in the body. And so it was a way of saying all your organs should always be turned to God. You know? They did not mean that there was literally 613 mitzvot, but once enunciated in the Middle Ages, the game began of counting the 613. Now, nobody agrees with anybody else about how to do the count, right? But the organic view. I always say that all great Jewish texts are made up of multiple authors. Yeah. Torah is like that. Talmud is like that. Shulchan Aruch had one author, but that wasn't good enough because Isserles had to write his notes, and then other people write their notes on the side, and you can't do the Shulchan Aruch unless you also have all the other notes. All great Jewish canonical books are multi-authored because to be a functioning religion, you have to be able to deal with the diversity of human personality and with the diversity within us. And that's the gift of Torah, that it blesses that diversity.
We could go on for hours, but perhaps before inviting Rabbi Gelber, and I think there will be comments and questions from the audience, maybe what I'll round up my interaction with you is the very first words you present to the reader is the epigraph. The simple meaning of the text is constantly unfolding. I think you could expound on that for hours.
So I'll just say one thing about it, that line comes from a medieval commentator, not from a modern commentator. That's what struck me about it. It's
12th century.
You know, it's the Rashbam. It's Rashi's grandson. So the beauty of diversity is that it's constantly unfolding. It just allows us to live in sort of bouncing back and forth and opening up new vistas. There were attempts to write a single Torah. It happened after the Bible, after the Torah was promulgated. For instance, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've discovered something called the Temple Scroll, where the rituals of the temple, which are in various places in the Torah and sometimes contradict each other, are made into a unified way of doing the temple ritual. In the Book of Jubilees, there's a resolution of all the contradictions in the stories of the Bible. Yeah, I mean, in the narrative parts, in the early patriarchal parts, right? And there you have, famously, the second chapter of Genesis has the story of Adam and Eve, and the first chapter of Genesis has the creation of the world without any sense of the kind of tumult that went on in the Garden of Eden. And there in the Book of Jubilees, you have the creation story as it appears, the first 6 days. But as you get to the sixth day, then you have the story of the Garden of Eden. So it's, instead of being a separate story in a second chapter, it's part of the story of the sixth day. But that's a way of kind of resolving the contradictions. There were attempts to resolve the contradictions, but living with that, the diversity, I think, is a great gift for us.
One of my takeaways, I think, part of our understandable, approach for most of us, we want to be told Judaism is X. Judaism is a civilization. I need to figure out my place in contributing. Judaism is a practice. Judaism, right? I hear someone begins Judaism is, I think I hear Rabbi Feld saying, stop, you've gotten it wrong from the start.
I wonder if Kaplan chose the word civilization, and Mel Scott can help me here, if he chose the word civilization precisely because he wanted to do this kind of sense of diversity. That is, of Kaplan's sense of inclusiveness.
I don't think.
Speak into the mic, so.
Okay. I want to make it clear that I don't think everything has to go back to Kaplan. But it's absolutely amazing to me. I hope you will be complimented by the fact that I think you are channeling Kaplan. No, I'm not finished. What you're doing is an exact embodiment. He wrote an article in 1914 called The Supremacy of Torah. And what he said was that origin is not determinative, function is determinative. And what you show us is the way in which the different elements in the Torah function. And Kaplan didn't really work out the details, but you work out the details.
Thank you, Mel. That was lovely. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. Rabbi Gelber, why don't you come up? Rabbi Gelber of Congregation HaBonim.
We get a third chair. I feel like I'm back in the office at JTS. What a gift. What a gift. It's such an honor to be here with my colleague and teacher and friend, Rabbi Feld, and to meet Abe, who imagined this into being. So that's wonderful. And thank you to SAJ for organizing and sponsoring this amazing conversation. When Eddie says that this book came from his experiences with the students at JTS, I'm not sure that we can really imagine what that means in reality. We had the gift of working together in the rabbinical school at JTS. His concern every day for those students who would become our rabbis, their minds and their souls was consuming for him, and consumed our conversations and our work in the school, which was so significant. This is a huge gift. This is a huge gift. I feel like when I was reading the book, and especially in listening to you, like it was a tikkun, that it was some sort of healing that needed to take place because of where people were when they were coming in to begin this next part of their journey towards spiritual leadership. And I will say that I did some of this work of biblical criticism in college, and before rabbinical school. And for me, even learning to write in the RSV, to write in the book, was like a trauma. This was not the way I was raised. What is this nonsense about taking a pen to this and then pulling the pieces apart? So I think that what led to this writing, what led to this creation and the book itself is really quite extraordinary. So yasher koach to you, and thank you. And thank you. I think, Eddie, when you said that this gift of showing the layers of Torah, were like revealing them as a sort of like a spiritual outpouring, and that biblical criticism is a way of rediscovering Torah, I think that is really spot on. My experience of reading this book was sort of an invitation to returning to history so that we could gain strength for our next narrative writing of a relationship. And I know that you're very focused on law, and this is about law. And throughout my reading of this book, I kept coming back to the idea of narrative, because I think these different pieces and layers are really about a story and different entryways into our history and how we became who we are and how we live who we are. Pirkei Avot teaches that the world is anchored on three things: on Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, on our Torah teaching, on worship, and acts of kindness. And then it goes on to say that the world is anchored on three other things: Din, Emet, and Shalom, right? Justice, truth, and peace. What do you mean? I thought it was on Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. Well, I was reading your book, and I think you added another triad there: Brit, Mitzvah, and Kedusha. Covenant, connection, and a sense of holiness. That really reminds us to think about, what is this relationship? What is this binding that we are expecting, that we are working with in our tradition? And how are we supposed to understand it and tell it and live that story? How does that keep us connected to one another individually and as a community? And which pieces of the story are going to help us to maintain a sacred life in any moment? And as you said, one day it could be this piece of Torah. One day it could be that piece of Torah. I keep thinking, and we have some members of Congregation HaBonim here in the sanctuary and also on the Zoom. I'm wondering, like, which ones will say, oh, right, when I ask, how can it be this? Because, I don't know, 6 months ago, didn't it say that? Yes, it did. And it's okay. And that doesn't have to sort of wreck the whole building. I feel like it's so much of what you pointed out is like living with the, like a jigsaw puzzle. How when you put the pieces together, you see the outline of the individual piece, but yet you have this great, amazing tapestry. And if you're like what happens in our house, we always get the box, so there's a piece missing, always. And it's that missing piece that is also so significant. Where do we fit? Where do we fit in that puzzle? And do you do that? Are you in the group that puts the outside together first? Or do you work with what you have and then go this way? And do you take one piece at a time? Or do you grab a whole bunch and lay them out and just see how it's going to go? And I think that's what you show us in this book about Torah, that it can be all of these things, depending on our lens and depending on the moment, depending on what's speaking to us, what's not speaking to us in a moment. What I loved, I just want to pull out a few places that I really loved. you speak about Eugene Borowitz and David Hartman, and you say that who we are today is to be brought into relation with the worship of the divine and the ethical behavior with which God instructs us and desires that we and our society reflect. We can't live in a vacuum as Jews. We have to be connected to one another. We have to be connected to the earth. We have to be connected to what's going on in ourselves and outside of ourselves. One other piece of text that I loved was the way in which you spoke about Bache ben Pekuda and his cultivation of teaching us that the way is to cultivate our personal experience. That is extraordinarily popular these days, and I don't mean that in a flippant sense. There's a lot of focus on character development and internal reflection and growth. But you put that alongside Martin Buber, who says that I and thou, we really have to look at the other person. And I think that the lesson here in all of these layers is that it's not this one versus the other. It's this and something else, so that, the and, I think is so critical, because it's a practice that teaches us how to be in the world. You end the book close to the end. Talking about the ways in which Judaism is a way of life, not necessarily a belief system. But when we think it's only a way of life, we leave out the importance of the specific of the law, and that we have to put all of it in to the omelet, as Robert Alter would say, or the cholent, or whatever it is. It's got to all be in the mix. And then you write, this understanding of Torah should ultimately impel an underlying acceptance of difference. Through the expression of different varying formulations, Torah is made whole. Engage each, and I'll leave the little piece there, but your takeaway is that we need to engage with each other. We need to argue with each other. We need to wrestle with each other over the rightness of our way and learn from one another. I would add also that we have to see one another and appreciate who we are. And through that collectivity of interpretation, God's truth is made known. That's what the Gemara is about. That's who we are about. Again, this is what it means to have a chavruta. I feel like I want to read this book again with a chavruta. I think we're going to be reading this book at HaBonim, and really starting to unpack without fear of the different layers and the different voices, and really using that as a prototype, as a framework for thinking about who and how we can be, and where our tradition comes from and what we're going to do about it. I want to leave us with this thought. For me, the important takeaway is that our surroundings affect who we are and how we are. I think that's so much of what you lifted up, that again, we don't live in a vacuum. We see what's going on around us and we integrate with that to whatever extent. And that was our history as a people as well. Our behaviors, our beliefs, our sense of self, and how we tell our story based on that is really up to us. We get to choose how we're going to tell that narrative. We get to choose whether we're going to uplift the stranger, how we're going to see the enemy, when, where. I'm thinking about Israel in it. So, and here too, what are we going to leave out? And what are we going to, and how are we going to write things in? And in order to do that in the best way, in order to do that in a sacred way, in a moral way, in a holy way, We have to commit to, let me for you, bless you. We have to commit to discovering, again, without fear. We have to not be afraid to engage, and I always say, you have to be open to being surprised. And I think that is at the heart of Torah, and the Torah and the way in which you offer it, that these contradictions are really okay, but we have to see them and own them, and help live our lives through that lens and with all of that in mind.
Just thank you so much, Lisa. And then, I mean, you said so much about the book that was really at the heart of what I was after. And
Tell me if I missed the mark. That's what this is about too.
I would just say that I think that book clubs that have formed, in which people read it together, have really been very productive. And I know of several that have gone on, and people have called me at the end and asked their questions and commented on what happened to them. So yes, I think your suggestion of picking it up as a group effort is really spot on. It works very well as a book read together.
So from the in-person and Zoom audience, on Zoom you can use the raise hand function. In the audience you can raise your hand that Rabbi Feld explains God doesn't have. Danielle Gerard.
I was really struck, first of all, thank you very much, that was great, we're gonna buy your book immediately. I was really struck by something you said at the beginning, that you didn't think ethics could have developed had there not been monotheism. But of course I went to, well, there's monotheism and we don't employ our ethics, and I was wondering if you could count on that. If you could please comment on that.
So I want to step back a little bit to get to that. The surprise, one of the surprises, and I think the biggest surprise in the research, was to discover that each of these moments were fueled, if you will, by prophets. In the north, the story of Elijah and Elisha. In Deuteronomy, Huldah the prophetess, who validates the book of Deuteronomy. In the case of the Holiness Code, so clearly the incorporation of prophetic insights, beginning with Ezekiel but of course much earlier. We normally think of prophets as opposed to the establishment. That's what we've been taught, right? They stand outside and yell. These are prophets who stand inside and create a dream, create a new society, create a vision. So we ought really to think about the way prophetic insight is central to all of Judaism. It's central to the Covenant Code, it's central to Deuteronomy, it's central to the Holiness Code. It is, all of it is an attempt, if you will, to live out a prophetic dream in real life and to cultivate that side in a real life. In this, I'm struck by last week's parasha, this last Shabbat, right, is the story of the golden calf, right? The story of the golden calf is set in the middle of, on the one hand, we have the laws how to build the sanctuary, and then after the golden calf is the building of the sanctuary. So between these two poles of the sanctuary, you have the story of the golden calf. Now, Moses went up to the mountain 10 chapters earlier. In the middle, we have these other chapters about the sanctuary. The Bible knows how to tell a straight story. Why doesn't it have Moses come down? We have at the end of Mishpatim, it says that Moses was on the mountain for 40 days. So the obvious next thing is, and the people were upset that he was there so long, and and they started. Instead, we have to wait 10 chapters to get there, and it's placed in the middle of the sanctuary. And who builds the golden calf? The high priest Aaron. Sanctuaries can become the property of corrupt people, or they can become instruments of the divine. Religion can be as corrupted as any other human institution, or it can be something glorious. Can be both at the same time? What did you mean by that?
I think it can be an instrument for good as well as an instrument for evil, and that there is no way of discerning between the two, because we have all of these impulses as individuals inside us, and there is no one way of resolving all those issues. Yes, we have to strive. Yes, we have to choose to want to strive. And I think we have trouble with that.
The difference, I think, is between the want and the acceding to, okay, we can't do it. There's a big difference between the two. I think of it in terms of journalism and truth, for instance. Right? Yes, journalists don't always get it right, and yes, journalists have prejudice, but there is a difference when you try to get it right and when you know, okay, it's all lies, so I'll lie too. There's a big difference between the two. And so, yes, the human story is always a story of our finitude. Right? And our starting place ought to be, we're going to fail. But we're going to try to do it better.
Beautifully said, thank you.
Two things. One, I'm very struck by last week's Parsha and your mention of it, because I became very aware last week about the fact that what's also in the Parsha is about Bezalel and the others who have the gift and ability to create the objects that go into the Mishkan and the tent and everything. And Aaron does not have that. So in your saying that he was corrupt, there's no mention that Aaron has any of those skills. So I started imagining what the calf might actually have come out looking like. One could just, not the way we see pictures of it, but something that, anyway, that's kind of adding a bit of humor to it in a way, but my realization that, but I would like to ask, I have not read the book yet, but this has been a fascinating conversation, thank you, is how, and I think you may have said this, but if you didn't, I'm asking it, how you see within all of this our understanding of Judaism as a practice.
When is our end time?
I think we can go about 15 more minutes if you like. I know Matt also has a question. There may be others.
Yeah, maybe people on Zoom. Here, I must say, I think the Holiness Code, if you will, got it right. the starting place of Jewish practice is Shabbat. If you even whether you observe a whole day or a little part of a day or some part of the day, I don't know anybody who could light Shabbat candles and close their eyes and not feel something happening. I mean, something happens in that moment of ushering in a moment of quiet and peace, a moment of blessing the members of one's family, blessings people we know. Yeah, that's the beginning. So Judaism as practice is a way of cultivating a certain kind of consciousness of being at rest with existence. It's also about going out to the world. That is, there isn't one, it's part of Jewish diversity that it isn't only an internal moment. Lisa really touched on that in her wonderful summary. She talked about Bachya, who talks about developing the inner life, kavanah, and Buber, who talks about a relationship with another person and reaching out to the other. It's so interesting that if you look at the great Jewish theologians of the 20th century, Buber, Rosenzweig, Levinas, I'll leave out Kaplan for a moment. They all talk about relationships with the other. Unlike some other theologians who talk about the cultivation of the inner life, right? The inner life cannot be cultivated without being in relationship with other human beings. And I lost your name. Phyllis. Phyllis is right that too is always subject to failure. Yeah. But I mean, Heschel said, the one commandment that you can be assured you will never observe fully in your life is love your neighbor as yourself. No one can. You know, how much we're annoyed by people. You know, I visited a Trappist monastery in upstate New York where they had only 10 monks left. And they took me around. They appointed someone to take me around, and he said, I said, why are you here? Yeah, and he said, I'll tell you why we believe. We believe that if we 10 people could learn to live together, we would have something profound to teach the world. But you know, you go to sleep and you know who's snoring and keeping you awake. You know who didn't clean up properly. You know, it gets to you, everybody, to love. But wouldn't we be so much less of human beings if we didn't have the ideal of love your neighbor as yourself? So, to include the dream that is impossible to fulfill as part of who we are, which is what the Holiness Code teaches us, is to include the dream, means that we won't stop where we are, but we will always move on.
Matt Zuckerbrot.
I found it a very worthwhile session. And
You can
so
buy the book. It'll be.
I won't stop there. And so I'm sad to come across in my somewhat usual negative way. And it's not about the book. It's not about your ideas. It's to recognize that we talk as a community. We put things in terms of we. We think in terms of the Jewish people. But most, I get the idea of that Christianity and maybe some other religions, I suspect so. I can't say I'm an expert in this subject. Talks about individuals, about individual salvation, about perfecting oneself as an individual. And I think that's one reason we get the hate of the world directed at us, because we're not looking for the same goal. We're looking to make this life what it should be, what it could be, and what it must be. And they are looking for the other life often, and it's very different. And so, if you have any comment on this comment,
Hour to the program. That's a major theme of the book.
The important thing here for me is a remark by Zalman Schachter, the late Zalman Schachter, who said that the religions of the world are like all these people who look at an elephant from different perspectives. Some people will look at the head and describe, oh, look, the elephant has this incredible nose. And some people look and say, look how big and thick this elephant is. And some people will look at the tail and say, look how it wags. Well, the religions of the world are all made up of the people who look at the elephant. We all are looking at the same thing, but we're describing a different part of it. And we each have a function, because you couldn't describe the elephant unless you put all 10 together. Yes? So we each have a function. And if you took one away, you would have less of a picture. So we are all, we are seeing different parts of the picture. We are not the same. Hinduism is not the same as Judaism, and Islam is its own thing. We all have our own language, which is a very important part of making up the totality of the human family. But, and this I learned from my teacher, Ernst Simon, you can't speak from every perspective. Every human being speaks from one perspective. It all may describe a totality. None of us can live in the totality, because all of us have to take a stand somewhere. And when we take a stand, we are looking at the world from that particular viewpoint. And you need to take a stand in order to have a viewpoint. What Judaism provides for us is a language by which we can enter and see the world. It provides us a language in which we could see ourselves. It's a language in which we can see our relationship to others. There are other languages. This is our language, and what I try to do is to show the incredible flexibility and elasticity of this language.
I think Matt's question also goes to some of your discussion of the tradition that developed from the covenant code and the traditions that develop from the holiness code. And when you talk about Borowitz and Hartman and the importance of the focus on Israel as a people, and then you talk about individual development and individual self-perfection, that these are both parts of our tradition.
Yes.
Nancy Ledmer.
Does somebody on Zoom have a, should we look to somebody on Zoom? After Nancy. Nancy should go first, but one,
I was so struck by these different ways of the law, partly because very recently at the Sojak Shabbat, we were talking, I did a tish with Alison Spitz about welcoming the stranger, and there are 36, unless that's also apocryphal, like 613 iterations of you shall be kind to the stranger. One says you shall be kind to the stranger because God looks out for the stranger. Another one says you should be kind to the stranger because you were slaves in Egypt. A third one adds to that, and because you understand the feelings of the stranger. And I started, because of your analysis, I started to think about that. And if I had been able to, I only looked at 4 different variations, but each one, I believe, would have reflected these distinctions that you're speaking about in terms of what is motivating it, what is the environment in which it's arising. So I found this fantastic and really interesting. I'm buying the book, and I'll only add what I was told when I was growing up in Hebrew school. You may know who said this, and this relates to some of the questions. Don't judge Judaism by the Jews, judge the Jews by Judaism. Now, putting aside that we don't exactly know what is, I actually think that responds to at least some of the questions.
Is there a hand up on Zoom? I'm not seeing it, but no?
it's been a pleasure to just be with you, to respond to you, and to hear Lisa, to hear Abe. Thank you so much for allowing me to be with you for this hour and a half.
In the lobby are 1, books for sale, 2, snacks. I don't want to close without a special hello and welcome to Merrill. It is so beautiful to be back in the sanctuary with you. I don't know if I was ever in the sanctuary before without a comment. So I missed that. So we've only scratched the surface of this book. I have so many particular questions. I didn't ask any of them because I think you have to read the book before you get to any of these particular questions. And I hope we succeeded in giving you a taste of, 1, what this book is about, why Rabbi Feld wrote it, and the richness of the book. So thank you, Rabbi Feld. Thank you all for coming.